Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the podcast, the YouTube channel, wherever you're finding us. Super excited to introduce to you Jacquelynne Sukatan, who we met through work, and you're an amazing seller. And one of my visions is to create because there's not a lot of Asians. Well, I think now there's more younger Asians going into sales, but at least growing up, I felt like I was an anomaly. So it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit more about your journey. Clearly you've been very successful and would love to pick your brain on just sharing best practices on how you were able to be so successful. And so, yeah, I'm excited to have you on the podcast.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the mentors we have in common is Paul Park, who's like such an amazing leader, and I would love to ask you a little bit more about like what you learned from him and some of the lessons. And it sounds like he's impacted a lot of reps, a lot of Asian reps all over, and I'm sure beyond the Asian community. But he was really inspiring for me because when I first joined, he was one of the few that were at that high level. So I remember hearing the way he spoke about ecosystems and partnerships and just adding value to his network, and it just blew my mind that someone had that mindset.
Yeah, I think so. Prior to my current position, well, I guess I'll take a step back. So when I started sales, I actually graduated. I went to college thinking I was going to be a nurse, and I graduated in advertising. I graduated when there was a downturn in advertising, so I got laid off because I was an entry level position person. And
Hmm.
in the meantime, a recruiter lured me into sales, and I'm like, I have never sold before. I will just do this so I get a job. So my first job was at a tech startup, and it was a very transactional sales. So pick up the phone, although they were warm leads, it was people that utilized our website that were using the free service, and my job was to upsell them, right? And because
Hmm.
of that transactional sale, I've known a transactional sales model.
Hmm.
It was the Paul Park and the William Chems of the world that
Hmm.
actually taught me, okay, well, how do you actually become an asset to the people that you're speaking to? Why would people work with you? Why do you have to
Hmm.
just send an email or a cold call while you could actually build something and create a type of ecosystem where people know who you are, and you could actually help them not just transactionally, but whatever needs they need. Like if someone needs a lawyer, connect them with your ecosystem with a lawyer that can help them. And that's the one
Hmm.
thing that Paul Park taught me.
Hmm. Yeah, and we always hear shout out to William if you're listening to this. Like he sounds like it's funny because obviously there's a lot of Asians in the US, but it sounds like we always get reconnected with each other. And yeah, they're both very mindful of their ecosystem. They're always looking to connect people together. And it's inspiring really, like to just always be thinking like, okay, how can I, because it does take work, right? It's not easy to maintain like a really strong ecosystem. And it's really intentional the way they approach like adding value and staying in touch in their cadence of connecting with their top channel partners.
Agreed, fully. Um, I mean, at the end of the day, too, it's just like if let's say hypothetically you're selling SaaS sales, or you're selling, I don't know, in some situations HR, right? We're always so pigeonholed, especially when you start a new company and you're trained about learning that one product. You kind of forget all the other assets that you provide to people. So I think to
Hmm.
your point and to the Paul Parks in the world, it's like you always have to take a step back and say, okay, well, what other
Hmm.
value can I bring
Hmm.
other than whatever I'm trying to sell?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? I think so many of us are just pigeonholed in different things. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that do what we do. There's a lot of competitors, a lot of people that are in sales. And it's really about thinking holistically, like, okay, like, yes, obviously we can help with HR and the benefits and health insurance and all that. But who else are they looking to meet? How can I add value beyond, because there's obviously a lot of value that we add from that lens, but it's also, are there VCs, are there private equity firms, are there attorneys that they're looking for, are there accountants that they're looking for, right? And just thinking, taking a step back and just thinking, like asking them like, hey, like who are you looking to meet? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the struggles, and like how can I help? Like genuinely, how can I be of service?
Yes, exactly. And of course, like let's say hypothetically, someone starts a new company. Someone's first thought process is the only value I could bring are probably clients that I signed, right?
Right.
So it's almost like the chicken before the egg, right? Like, how can I provide value if I have not
Mhm.
signed enough clients yet? Or how can I provide
Mhm.
value if my book of business or my eco is still small? But
Yeah.
there are other assets that you could bring outside of that. Like last night. So last night, by building an ecosystem, I was invited to co-host an ecosystem dinners to SaaS founders. Every SaaS founder in the room, and it was a very private dinner. There was probably about 15, 18 of us total.
Huh.
All of them have raised at least $1 million in funding. Um, and it was very much an open forum. We sat there for about 3.5 hours. I primarily listened because I'm not a founder. But the conversations that came up were the conversations that all of us talk to in every day, right? Like, how are we dealing
Huh.
with remote workforce? And their end as a founder, like, how are you balancing culture with remote force?
Yeah.
Me not being a founder, they would ask me, like, what are your thoughts? Like, you work for a big corporation. How is that like for
Huh.
you? Another thing, and the big talk track is go to market. And for
Mm.
that, these specific SaaS founders, a lot of them are very successful. They're saying, well, with the chat GPT, for example,
Huh.
we are realizing that a lot of our SDRs, it takes like 20 touches. And at that point, people are
Mm.
inundated with so many emails. And
Mm.
they themselves are like, I have so many emails, I automatically delete it.
Mm.
And then the topic came about selling in general. And a lot of them admitted that the best sales that they've done with the people that they trust are people that they've met on events, at networking
Mm.
events, people that they met through mutual contacts where they didn't automatically sell them. It was
Mm.
after like the third and fourth meeting, after they knew where they like lived or where they
Mm.
what they did for a living, or not what they did, but like their hobbies, that they actually went in and sold them. And I
Mm.
think going back to building an ecosystem, it's really about like humanizing yourself and using what you can to like bring anything, even if it
Mm.
involves like giving them advice through your experiences.
Mm. That's a great call out, right? I remember some of my first TriNet clients, like I remember feeling so accomplished when they would invite me to their company holiday parties, right? And I was like, wow, like that's cool. Like that I'm one of the employees that they invite me to their holiday parties. And one of the most successful, so I'm Vietnamese, and Trung Nguyen, who he was the number one salesperson at Microsoft Azure, at ServiceNow, all these like super big, very competitive tech companies. And I'll never forget, he always told me like, hey, like all of my clients, like we talk to each other like we're best friends. Like they'll invite me to their kids' graduation, they'll invite me to like their kids' weddings and things like that. And I'm just like, man, like that's crazy because I think so many of us are conditioned to like, hey, I gotta separate, like I gotta keep work, and then, like, but and family. But it like what I learned from him is like he's like, and this is like much earlier on in my career, but he's like, man, like you're too formal, you're too like proper. He's like, man, just loosen up a little bit. He's like, and I remember I was like, oh wow, because in my mind I felt like I was loose, but he's like, nah, man, like just talk to me like we're friends, like, and I was just like, oh wow. But yeah, it's just interesting how people have different approaches. But I think when you first join corporate America, you're like, oh, I gotta be a certain way, and I gotta be like, it's interesting, and seeing how now like I'm much more comfortable just having like a normal conversation. I don't have to be so quote unquote like buttoned up and all that stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, don't get me wrong, like there is still value of doing traditional prospecting. Like that's always going to be important, traditionally
Yeah.
prospecting. I think that like building an ecosystem and oh, I thought my phone was on silent. Building an ecosystem is something that you do on the side. So like
Yeah.
one of the things that we were taught like in our organization, and you know this, as well as like my mentor at the time, is like while you're doing your ebbs and flow, you also have to
Mm.
commit yourself to, especially if you have not built that ecosystem yet,
Mm.
maybe one or two
Mm.
networking events a week.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Meet people. And it's kind of interesting. So San Francisco, that's where I live. It's a very small city. It's 7 by 7.
Hmm.
Particularly in tech, particularly now because a
Hmm.
lot of people actually left the city because
Right.
of COVID.
Hmm.
You go to these in-person networking events, which by the way, more people are actually very excited to attend these events
Yeah.
because they miss in person.
Huh.
And you start seeing the same people. Oh, sorry, guys. You start seeing the same people over and over and over again.
Huh.
And you realize, why am I attending these events by myself while I could be
Hmm.
attending it with a group of people?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's I mean, obviously New York City is a big city, but yeah, to your point, and you still run into the same people over and over again. And yeah, a lot of people have moved away from New York, right? So, and people are craving that like face-to-face interaction. So, one of the reasons why I decided to come back to TriNet was because I do miss that, right? Because when I was selling to the Fortune 1000s, like that wasn't happening, right? They're all about efficiency. It's all about and my accounts were like all over the world, so it was literally impossible to fly all over. Like it was just more efficient, like, hey, let's hop on a Teams call, hop on a Zoom call, we'll bang it out. But it felt so business like, so I do appreciate how our strategy and our approach is more of like boots on the ground, more face to face. And to your point, people are craving it. Like it's we've had a rough 3 years, and I'm sure in SF similarly, like in New York, like we've had some rough. New York was going through a lot, and now it's just great to be with people in person, and it's lively. It feels like back to normal, which is nice.
Yeah, I agree. And even if someone doesn't live in your area, right? Like there is a referral partner that actually has sent me leads last year, beginning of this year as well, that lives in a completely different state. So, virtual goes a long way. A lot of us are used to the virtual world anyway. So, what are some things you can do? Provide a sugar wish. Like I am all about sugar wish. I'm promoting a company, not sponsored,
Huh,
but they're awesome, right? You don't need anyone's physical address. You
huh,
basically send them an email, they open a link, and from there they can get candles, they can get a bottle of wine or whatever the case is. That goes a
huh.
long way. I actually know some individuals that use that to prospect as well. Um, or something as easy as like a Starbucks gift card,
Mhm.
something small goes a long way.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there are a lot of these companies that are doing like virtual like wine tastings, and I know with the CPA program, we do a lot of like those types of events because people are scattered more. Like there's a lot more. The last 3 years, it seems like everyone has moved away. So it's just interesting to see the gradual change, and now how acceptable it is to even if a small company can have five different people in five different states, whereas in the past, like it seemed like a requirement, like no, you have to be somewhat local. But it seems like it's much, and obviously with a lot of tech companies, they're even more scattered, it seems like.
Yeah, I agree. It does help too, like meeting someone. So I tell my mentees this. Whenever I host an event or I go to a networking event, one, I always look at the speakers and see if they would be prime ecosystem partners or
Mhm.
prospects with us, and just doing like a LinkedIn light message prior,
Mhm.
like, hey, I'm attending this event. I hope to see you there.
Yeah.
Attending that event, obviously, many cases, especially if they're a speaker, they don't have time to talk to you. Everyone's
Right.
asking them questions. But the good thing is, after the fact, it's better for you to email them and say, hey, I went to an event. I heard you say this, this, and that.
Mhm.
I thought that was interesting.
Mhm.
Would you like to meet? You have a better chance of that person sitting with you and meeting with
Mhm.
you than just cold reaching out. So, like, that's another value add as far as like physically going out there or even doing something virtual, right? Going to an
Mhm.
online panel. I mean, I'm doing one in the future, but like doing something like that, hearing someone speak, remembering something that they said, and reaching
Mhm.
back out to them and quoting what they said,
Mhm.
um, normally gets you in.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think so many of us, with the invention of all these tools, we become lazy to a certain extent, where sometimes people will send an invite, and it literally just takes like an extra 45 seconds, but just put the context like, hey, I met you at this event, like would love to connect. But sometimes people are too lazy to even do that, right? And it's just I do think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful. Like I think sales professionals in general need to be a lot more thoughtful in terms of like our follow-ups, how we add value, and even just like you said, just something little as like, hey, I did some research, I listened to your podcast. Even if you spent 5 minutes listening to their podcast, it just shows like some thoughtfulness versus nowadays people just like copy and paste, copy and paste. It just seems like some of us have over leveraged the technologies too much where we're afraid of for the sake of just like hitting the numbers, right? It's an interesting dynamic I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's making it very personal. Another thing is making it short. Like when I read
Mm.
emails now, unless you've actually had a full-on conversation and they know everything and they're part of the process, but if it's
Yeah.
like an early email, keep it short.
Mm.
You want to be able to create emails where they can look at it on their phone. And
Yeah.
just like in my personal life, like if I get an email other than like the New York Times in the morning, obviously, but like if I get an email from someone and it's that long, my immediate thought process
Mm.
is this is a bot
Mm.
or I don't have time to read this.
Mm.
So like that balancing act of how do I make it personal, but at the same time, really just stick into like, let's keep it at like 2 or 3 points
Mm.
versus let me talk about every single thing that would possibly be beneficial to you
Mm.
or whoever you're trying to sell.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think every year our attention spans get a little bit shorter, right? With the invention of TikTok, and I'm sure there'll be hundreds of other platforms that will be even more like less of an attention span than TikTok. It's clear that we people just need to be a lot more concise and be able to communicate more effectively. And sometimes that's rereading it, cutting out all the BS, all the fluff, and just getting straight to the point, right? Especially busy founders,
I
right? Like
agree.
they just don't have time for that stuff.
You know what's really funny? So, and I think me and you talked about this earlier. So, because sales was not my official background, I stumbled across from it or across or whatever the terminology is. So I started sales and in my old company, and I don't know about a lot of people listening, but like predominantly it is a male dominated industry.
Yeah.
And the company that I started, great company, great culture, great people, but like not that many women. And the people that I would reach out to at the time were primarily real estate brokers, which again, in that
Mm.
industry at that time, commercial real estate brokers, most of the people in my territory were men.
Mm.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I would write emails and I would delete emails because I didn't know how to communicate it in a way that was assertive, but at the same
Oh.
time, being a female, I didn't want to come off flirtatious or I didn't want to come off as if like it is the wrong message. And to your point, making things a lot shorter and that conversation we've had helped with my email abilities. I
Mm.
used to start emails with like, hello, I hope you're doing well, like which is great. It's great to greet someone, but I mean, if you go to chat GPT now, like, and they do default emails, that's normally like the first sentence, right? So like trimming the fat and just going straight to what you're trying to have that conversation with versus all the fluff.
Mm.
So that's like how I started making shorter emails. It was by how do I sound assertive? How do I just get straight to the point?
I love what you said. I think that applies for just even in life, right? Like just being a professional, being a business person, just knowing your time, your worth, and knowing the value of your time. And I don't know if it's an Asian thing, but I've been guilty of like ending every email with like, "Oh, thank you for getting back to me," or whatever it is, like all this stuff. And I'm not really sure why that is, but it does seem like a lot of us struggle with, and maybe it's when you first join a professional work environment, right? You're just like overly apologetic, but it really I have to like really intentionally like stop doing that, and people respect you a lot more too, right? When you know like, hey, instead of being all like, oh, like thank you so much, like you spend an hour, you know what I mean? It's like I don't know. It's interesting. I've noticed that trend for me as well.
Yeah, same with me. I used to say sorry a lot. I said sorry. I had a great manager, many great managers, that I would write emails and she would proofread it when I first started. She's like, you said sorry twice in this email. Delete it.
Yeah.
So like I had to have someone check, like, stop saying sorry. Just because you said sorry in one sentence and I apologize in a different sentence for the end, that's still saying sorry.
Mm.
So like once is
Mm.
enough.
Yeah, and just I think when you first get into sales too, you're like, oh, how much value can I add to this person, right? Oh, this guy's the CEO of whatever like company. And I don't know about you, but in the beginning, even when I called people, I was just like, oh, like I'm so thankful you picked up the call. It's like, dude, like just get to the point, you know? So it's like a lot of training that I had to like rewrite these narratives where I'm like, hey, like my time is valuable. Like I'm doing them a service, like I'm doing them a favor by offering my expertise, my time, right? I'm a super connector, like I'm helping them out. But it took me a while to realize that and not be so like, oh yeah, thank you so much, like yeah, that was an amazing, you know. And just looking back at it, it's so cringy that I was like that. It's just it's weird.
I mean, it's hard too, especially like to your point, you when you first started, right? And when I first
Yeah.
started, if you didn't have, I feel like salespeople in general have like thick skin, right? Like until you like really get into sales and get used to rejection, you know, you're not going to fully understand. It took a lot of rejection and a lot of like, failed sales attempt to really become who are you, because you learn from your mistakes, right?
Hmm.
So it's just in our nature.
It is funny hearing you say that you used to be like, oh, sorry, or I apologize, because obviously I know you now as the person that has transformed that, right? So it's just interesting to hear you say that because how you present yourself is very confident and very self-assured, and it's interesting to me. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't know, I would have no idea that that's something that she used to struggle with.
Well, I think it's also, again, it's for so long I thought of myself as just a salesperson, just a salesperson that sold whatever I'm trying to sell. That's how I get paid. Until
Mm,
you actually take a step back and say, okay, there is more that I can provide outside of this. There are people that I'm connected to, whether or not like we have very strong connections because I sold them or because, we do business together. That person's supposed to is making a big difference, right? Like we
mm,
work with a lot of nonprofits. I'm sure you and I have worked with a lot of founders that are kicking butt right now. And, there are founders that I've met before when I first started TriNet. It's literally just the founder and they were all 1099s.
mm,
Eventually they were big enough to have whatever I was selling. And now
mm,
you see them and they're giant companies. And you're like,
mm.
I remember this. And,
Yeah.
it's humbling, but it's also great to know that you've met like great people.
Hmm. It's interesting because I noticed that even with internal folks now, like I've come back 4 years, a little bit over 4 years later, and I'm like, wow, like people have grown so much. And of course I have as well, right? But it's just interesting to see people like really develop and grow, and like a lot can happen in 4 years, right? So I think that's neat as well, where I come back and I'm like, wow, like there's people that, I would say struggled a bit in the beginning, right? And it took them a while to get launched off, and now they're like killing it, but it's really compound interest, right? It's like this didn't happen overnight, right? It was like a lot. And I think that's what I respect about people in sales. Like when we get each other, right? People who like yourself that are crushing it, hitting their numbers early. Like we all get it. We all respect each other. We all know like, hey, like there's a lot that people see all the rewards, people like, oh, they get to go to Barcelona, they get to go to Hawaii and all this stuff. But everyone in sales knows, hey, like it wasn't easy. Like, kudos
I
to you, props to you.
I didn't hit club my first year. I think they're okay. So the things that made me click where I'm like, okay, this makes sense. Even in my past job, I think one is just reaching out to people in general that could be good mentors. Because the truth be told, like you may have a current mentor or you may have a manager that's really helping you out, but sometimes
Mm.
people's styles aren't your style, right? Like there are
True.
certain things that I am really not good at. So what I did is I reached out to people in my industry and I looked even outside
Mm,
my company, just people in my
mm,
industry that I'm like, I like what you're doing. I can see myself do this.
Mm.
Do you have an hour to talk? Let's grab coffee or lunch. I think
Mm.
that was a really big change for me, because I think when I first started, I was doing things I'm not good at, and I was forcing myself to do things that I wasn't good at.
Mm.
Until I started interviewing the right people, I was like,
Mm.
okay, this clicks.
Mm.
Um, so I think that was like the best advice I got from someone, was just like, I can't teach you this. Figure
Mm.
out what works for you and just ask a lot of people. It's just be curious.
Mm. What advice would you give to someone who is overthinking it and they're just afraid of reaching out to people because they're like, oh, what if they don't get back to me? And that's probably the number one objection I hear on why people are afraid to like reach out for like potential mentors or just even have coffee chat with someone who seems like they're like killing it.
So I did this exercise on my own. I was like, again, this is during that time where I was like, I don't know, it's not clicking. I wanted to build an ecosystem. I wanted to replicate again, like the Paul Parks, William Chums in the world. And my insecurity at the time was like, I didn't close enough deal flow for me to introduce clients to feed the ecosystem.
Hmm.
Um, and by ecosystem, for those that are listening, and sure, if you already know what it is, but just in case, it's basically a network of individuals that you can give business to or go to events with, or any kind of like give, and they can give something back to you. So it could either be transactional, where if I close a deal and I know that they need a, let's say, a fractional CFO, and they're looking for a fractional CFO, I already know one or two fractional CFOs that they can
Hmm.
speak with, right? There's also indirect ones where they could invite you to events. There's events like the one I did last night where it's not open to the public, but it's
Hmm.
an invite only. Those are the
Yeah.
best type of ecosystem. And then you have like the thought leaders in the world, and I know several, that the Lindsays of the world, if I don't know if she's listening, but she's great, where they do a lot of panels.
Hmm.
They're always doing some kind of thought leadership. And
Hmm.
by having them in your ecosystem, they could actually invite you to a panel or join, right? Or go to the event. What
Hmm.
was I forgot what I'm saying. I was talking about ecosystem. Um, what was the question again?
Well, I like how you bucket it into different tiers, right? So that way it's a good framework to think like, all right, how can I be strategic and intentional with my partnerships and because I do think earlier on in your career, we're just like, all right, I gotta like hustle and like work hard. But then
Yeah,
eventually you realize, okay, these people I should invest more time in, and these people I should probably not be as giving. There has to be some sort of give and take.
exactly. I remember where I was going with this, is it was like, how did I find my value? How did I get confidence to do
Mm,
that?
yeah.
So what I did, because I didn't have enough to exchange business with, I had a piece of paper, and on the left, I folded in half. On the left, I listed everything out that's like business related, things that I sold,
Hmm.
and what are the valuable assets that I can give to the people that I'm selling to. So that's pretty easy, right? Like if you're in a company and you went through training, you already know your value prop at that end, right? But
Mm,
really tailor it to like, how am I going to help my target? On the right, take that aside, and how do I as an individual, as
mm,
Jacquelynne, how can I assist people outside of what I do for a living? So what I did I remember writing this paper. I was born and raised in San Francisco. So like that is an asset. I'm a unicorn. For those that know, if you're still in San Francisco, at my age, you're a unicorn. So because of that, founders that are visiting or people that are new, I have insight, right? As someone
uh,
that's new, it's a good conversation track. Like, where do you
huh.
live? Things of that nature. Um,
Mm,
hobbies. So I have a colleague that did really, really well. That person actually works for a new company, but when they were here, their hobby was sailing. They actually owned a sailboat and they sail.
mm,
And so what they did is they created doing like a quarterly mixer where they invited their target audience to go sailing.
mm,
So again, making it personal. There are people that like golfing.
mm,
Okay, create a golf mixer, or like create a community of golfers. Little
mm,
things like that where you do have, everyone has value. It's not just company value.
mm. I love that. And I also hear some like everyone is different, right? There's no one path to road to success. And it's really discovering like what's your secret sauce, what makes you unique, and also and integrating it as well. It's like, hey, like let's say I'm really good at like I like throwing wellness events, right? Like maybe I throw like something interesting. It's like, oh, like let's do something interesting where we get to have all the. I think there's just so many creative ways to be successful, and I love what you said about like really intentionally, like because I don't think many of us have that do that exercise where we sit down and we're like on a piece of paper and we write down all these things. I think we're so many of us are like go go go, and that planning will help us a lot. But I think many of us don't or even know like, hey, this is an exercise that I can take on. Like it that's cool. It sounds like Paul was one of the people who inspired you to do something like that.
Paul was one of them, yeah. And I think it's also it's funny too, because there's two things that will one, obviously the professional level, I was able to be more confident, right, because of that, and knew some of the values that I could add. But also it made me better personally because I realized like, oh, I remember that I used to be good at this. Like that was
Mm,
an asset I had. Let me hone in on this craft because it's going to help me
mm,
professionally. So that was
mm,
one thing that actually did help.
mm,
It helped me professionally or personally as well. And I think the second thing to that and that activity and that mindset is it makes work fun. Because again, you
mm.
still have to do the basics. You still have to prospect, right?
Right.
That still pays the bills.
Yeah.
But waking up every day and knowing, like, for me, I like hosting events. I like bringing people together. Okay,
Mm,
well, I get to plan this event in the next 2 weeks. How exciting is that?
mm.
So you have something to look forward to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think our company is one of the unique companies where you can do a little bit more of that, like your own flavor, whether it's like an intimate dinner or golfing. Most other companies I've been a part of, like that's not really as promoted or it's just not common. So I'm grateful that we do have that opportunity. I know I was hosting like Rutgers monthly happy hours where I just invite all of my ecosystem like clients, channel partners, and everyone got together. And it was great because they would invite their people. And that was really cool. Like I and it just brought me so much joy. Like it didn't feel like work, which is one of the reasons why I'm back here because I'm like, wow, like every day was fun. Like it didn't, and of course, yes, there's gonna be some days that where you're smiling and dialing and you still have to do some of that, but I think we are in a unique situation scenario where we can do more things that bring us joy compared to the
Yeah.
average most sales reps.
But like, let's say hypothetical, and I worked at a startup before this. Let's say you work at a company where, you don't have like maybe a budget or whatever the case is, right? I was still able to do that at my startup. So what I utilize is again, going back to your assets. I worked with ecosystem partners that was able to
Mm,
afford the events,
mm,
and you always split that with multiple partners. And my value add at that point was like, I will prospect, give me an event and let me invite the people to fill the seats in this event. Um, so if you let me be part of this and you make me a co-sponsor and let me sit in this panel, I'll invite
mm,
as many people as I can. So like, don't always think about things being monetary because like that's not always the case, not even with the events that I'm working with, right? Like in many
mm,
cases, there's no money involved. It's like, what other assets can I bring? Can I invite people? Or,
mm.
do I know a venue? Remember me living in San Francisco, I know of venues that were affordable and like I have friends that I graduate with that are in the industry that can give me a good rate. So like
Mm.
small things like that go a long way.
It's clear that you're very resourceful, like you're good at leveraging and you're good at thinking strategically, and that's obviously I'm sure over time you're able to develop that. And I think that's great. It sounds like you're smart because you take inspiration from other people and you take what you're like, oh, okay, like I can learn from what other people are doing and then I can put my own spin on it as well.
Yeah. I just hold yourself accountable. I like to keep an Excel and just like start listing everyone that you meet with in your network that has bring some kind of value with any of those buckets, right? Are they a transactional partner where we can send leads?
Hmm.
Do they host a lot of events? And start remembering these people, put their LinkedIn on that Excel so you know when you're working with people or you're talking to prospects, you know who to refer business to. And
Hmm.
also know what other assets you have if everyone needs any advice or like again a location for their venue
Hmm.
um, within that realm.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Jacquelynne. This has been such a fruitful conversation. So many takeaways in being resourceful, being coachable, finding good mentors, learning from the best, being able to practice like communicating more effectively, being more concise with their communication, and just being awesome and having more fun at work too, right? That's such a huge lesson. Like we spend most of our days working, and I think it is important to have fun. So thank you so much for joining the podcast. Really enjoyed our conversation. Oh, and what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to reach out to ask you more questions?
LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn.
Perfect. So I'll definitely tag you on LinkedIn. And until next time,
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend.
you too.
Bye.